It's difficult to understate just how much of an impact food production has on the environment. Researchers estimate that food production accounts for over a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. With the Earth's growing population likely to accelerate this problem, companies big and small are searching for practical solutions. Today, we're talking with Yaupon, a Wilmington-based tea company focused on providing a healthy product, all while reducing waste and restoring local ecosystems.
Welcome to The Good Guide to Business, a podcast presented by Better Business Bureau.
The Good Guide is all about conversations with businesses, organizations, and local leaders who are going above and beyond to make the community a better place.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit down, and get ready for this episode's special guests, Andrew Kiley and Megan Rowe, the founders of Yaupon Tea Company. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us on this episode of the Good Guide podcast. We're so happy to have you and to hear more about Yaupon.
We're excited to be here.
Yeah.
Well, I want to start first talking about, I guess, the plant itself, the Yaupon holly. So can you guys talk a little bit about the history of this plant and maybe some of the health benefits it provides?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yaupon, for a lot of folks, is a pretty mysterious plant. For us, it's much more commonly known. But Yaupon is an evergreen shrub native just to the southeast of the United States. And so beyond many of the kind of unique health properties we can go into a little bit later, it's caffeinated, as well as contains a whole host of antioxidants similar to green tea or coffee that help aid in all sorts of different bodily functions. And so one of the really many unique characteristics of Yaupon is, of course, that it is only found here in the U.S. Locally, as well as those antioxidants and a few different other interesting molecules like theobromine, theophylline, which help counteract a lot of the side effects of caffeine intake.
Yeah. And then just general characteristics of it, in case anybody's looking in their backyard, is that it has small leaves that are serrated. Like he said, it's an evergreen shrub. And honestly, it's usually a nuisance to most people, which is also a vital factor of what we do and why we do it. And it has little red berries on the female plants. So if you ever need to look up or you're wondering what it looks like, we actually have a blog post on it on our website, which I'm sure you guys can drop the link to later. But
yeah, nice. And, now that I know what to look for, I've kind of seen this stuff all over the place. But again, it's still kind of amazing that you can make tea from this one plant that's pretty common all over our region. But I understand there's kind of some history behind the mystery of Yaupon, right? How it was kind of hidden from a lot of people for a while.
Yes, specifically so. So you go back a little bit, sort of the history of colonial times, and that's really when caffeine first gained popularity. It was throughout the 1600s. You saw a lot of folks in Europe, in Spain, France, especially drinking tea. But what many people didn't realize is that tea was, a lot of cases, Yaupon, coming from the southeastern part of the United States. And so for many years, that was actually one of the most popular tea drinks in the world, was Yaupon tea. And so it wasn't until around late 1700s, around the actually American Revolutionary War, until we really saw this Yaupon consumption increase. And so we talk a lot more about this on our website and on some different channels, but Yaupon was essentially kind of discouraged after the Revolutionary War. There was a lot of, I guess you could say, prejudice against Yaupon because it was this drink oftentimes associated with Native American usage. So that's actually where we get the Latin American term Ilex vomitoria, which for a lot of folks, it's a concerning sounding Latin name. And so, there's a lot of interesting history and culture around Yaupon and its association with Native Americans. But what we've found going back is it's actually a completely safe, super healthy, caffeinated tea that can, like I said, help in all sorts of different areas for folks.
yeah, so just to go on top of that, Native Americans used to drink it every day, especially for ceremonial reasons. And they would drink it and basically be like, okay, like this will help us with clarity in decisions and mental clarity. And so it's used ceremonially in that way. Also, fun little tidbit is that it was used after the Boston Tea Party. So after we threw all of our tea in the ocean that was imported by the British East India Company, and we were like, wait a minute, we need caffeine. That's when we turned back to Yaupon. And again, it kind of got that scientific name because of defamatory like campaigns, just because it did threaten the Dutch East India Company importing tea so much into the US.
Yeah, just to add there, like what Megan was talking about, during that time period, around the American Revolutionary War, the British East India Tea Company was huge. It was one of the largest companies or corporations in the world. And so they were very, very much threatened by the growth of Yaupon tea consumption. And yeah, it's funny to note the Boston Tea Party is this huge event that sort of everyone, at least here in the US knows about. But they sort of forgot to mention that the second half of that story where, we chucked all the English tea into the harbor in protest, but we still needed tea ourselves. And so Yaupon was actually sent to Boston under the name Liberty Tea, both in solidarity as well as to directly fuel the folks there in Boston. So kind of an interesting part of history that's sort of forgotten.
Yeah, I absolutely never learned about that in the history books. It's so cool to learn how this one little plant that's so prevalent in North America, I guess, in a way kind of fueled the revolution, right? You need caffeine to function, let alone to fight a war. I'm sure they were relying on something if they couldn't do British tea.
Yeah.
Absolutely. To go further, sort of, we saw a bit of a resurgence during the Civil War. Once again, the South was cut off from other, external sources of caffeine, and so they had to rely on Yaupon. Sort of to what sort of connects it with this sort of lower class sort of ideology, which of course we believe is very much not true. It's very interesting too. It kind of leads into what we at Yaupon Tea Co have tried to do, and sort of, in a sense, start a revolution with Yaupon. Showing how important it is to source locally as well as to, try to make a positive impact wherever you can.
Yeah. Can you describe what the tea tastes like?
Yeah, for sure. So we have 3 different flavors. They're all 100% Yaupon, but we get the different profiles based on the different processes that they go through, whether it's oxidation or light roasting. So when you try Yaupon, part of it's going to be familiar if you've ever had, green tea before, other teas before, oolong, black tea, what have you. Where it kind of differs a little bit is that it lacks the bitterness of traditional teas, and then it also has this like somewhat sweet, mild flavor that we call it like a beginning, middle, and end is like the flavor profile that you like go through. And so like this like end flavor is this like, oh, like this extra sweet like little burst at the end. So our Casina is most similar to green tea. It has this like grassy flavor to it a little bit. And then we have our golden, which is most like an oolong, and that has that sweet, almost honey-like flavor. In my head, I feel like it tastes like it has like a little bit of honey in it. And dark, which is most similar to black tea. And we actually have people use Yaupon to make traditional sweet tea in substitute of black tea because it takes less sugar to sweeten up to that like ideal, deeply sweetened, sugary taste that people are accustomed to.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and it sounds like, it tastes great. It has health benefits, but from my understanding too, it also can help ecosystems. How does it do that?
That's a great question. I'm going to let Andrew take it away because he has the beautiful brain behind how we made this all happen and our positive feedback loop.
Yeah, so to sort of describe it, it all sort of stems from Yaupon, and seeing that it itself is this naturally drought-resistant, salt-tolerant native species that really does thrive here in the Southeast, especially in areas that lack the sort of nutrients, or other factors that really you would need with a lot of other, plants or agricultural crops. Beyond that, we sort of realized that, Yaupon is literally everywhere. We joke with folks to check their own backyards, and it's, oftentimes literally growing underneath their nose. And so For a vast majority of these folks, though, now Yaupon is a nuisance crop, and so for a vast majority of these areas, it's actually overgrown because Yaupon is so native or grows so well and is a native plant. It can oftentimes crowd out ecosystems, reducing the biodiversity as well as the overall ecosystem health. So what we found in a vast majority of cases, the widespread removal of Yaupon from these ecosystems is actually going to benefit that entire ecosystem. Specifically, we're trying to highlight things like various ecosystem services, so things like clean water, helping to increase nutrients in the soil, as well as to increase biodiversity. So bringing back native plants and animals and different species that call this ecosystem home. And so the beauty is that this ecosystem type is the whole southeastern United States. It's essentially the same habitat as Yaupon, basically eastern Texas to about here in Wilmington or up to the Outer Banks. And so what we've found is by actually working with folks here in the community, this is landowners, anyone from someone with a big backyard that has some native Yaupon growth to much larger landowners. We found that we can actually partner with these folks to sustainably source our Yaupon. So actually removing it in a lot of cases from these landscapes, and then being able to track these positive benefits that we provide to the ecosystem. So it's a bit of a mouthful explaining it all, but the idea really is to be able to better reward and incentivize our local community members and really any entities that have these natural pieces of land, and to incentivize the further conservation of those lands. And sort of a benefit of all that is being able to source our Yaupon locally. And then we, of course, sell that to folks who drink our tea.
Yeah, and just to re-summarize that, we basically have 3 different ways that we approach any piece of land. The first is the piece of land doesn't have anything growing on it. And, the soil is sandy soil, which we have predominantly in Wilmington, and there's not much nutrients in the soil, right? And so then we can plant Yaupon there because it thrives in low nutrient, salty, droughty soils. And so then by planting Yaupon, that helps to bring in other species, whether it's, birds feeding on the berries or putting other nutrients in the soil for other plants to thrive on. And so that's how we increase biodiversity by planting Yaupon. Or there's a piece of land that has too much Yaupon, because for a lot of our friends in our community supplier program, they're like, okay, I have way too much Yaupon. This is overgrowing everything. It's killing everything. Like, please come and take it. And so in that case, it overgrows everything. And because it is such a strong plant, it outcompetes everything around it and eventually kills other things off. And so then it's only Yaupon there. And, that's not, ideal for a lot of ecosystems either. And so in that way, we remove the Yaupon, which also decreases fire risk and then increases biodiversity. And the last way is there's some Yaupon on a piece of land, and we manage it by cutting it back and just making sure that it doesn't become too overgrown for it to overcompete with everything else in the ecosystem. And so that's kind of the bread and butter of what we do, is being able to essentially take any piece of land and give value to it.
So you've talked about so many benefits and so many cool things that Yaupon does and that you do for the community with Yaupon, but what made you start working with Yaupon? Why did you start your business?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll hand it over to Megan here in a second. She can kind of explain it further. But I think for both of us, I think it just almost felt like there was this need. My story goes as far as I stumbled upon the plant quite literally out in the field doing some really unrelated research. Sort of kind of went down the rabbit hole from there, started to learn about the history, the fact that it was this local caffeinated plant. I too kind of struggled with a lot of the, side effects of coffee and caffeine intake. And so for me, it just felt like this kind of perfect remedy for all these issues. And then thinking about it more at, zooming out more of an ecological sense, an environmental sense, it just seemed like this kind of amazing opportunity to unite both community regeneration as well as being able to source this local caffeinated product. And I think that's kind of where Megan came along, is trying to be able to actually feasibly put this all together.
Yeah, and I think that for me personally, just growing up, I wasn't a business major or anything, but I feel like I had this idea of business that like there's like winners and losers, right? So it's like take a pharmaceutical company where it's like, okay, like they're kind of the winners because they can charge whatever they want for, vital medications, and then people that have to pay, hundreds and hundreds of dollars just to afford to live are kind of the losers. And so that comes from like my public health background, just learning about our systems and how a lot of these businesses work. And I think that for us, it was so important to have a business that everybody wins in. Um, and so that's was kind of my inspiration, is that I hadn't seen many businesses modeled like that. And so, that kind of came with its own like set of challenges with like building Yaupon, is like, okay, how do we ensure that we're benefiting every party every step of the way as we build this process? And I think that that's so important, just because our mindsets around business are changing. And I think that we see that and see the value of making sure that everybody wins. So yeah, I think that that's part of like where like my mindset came from with like starting a business, is like, hey, like let's like try to do something like different and like innovative, because the way that some businesses work just like doesn't really sit well with me. And um my entire family, everybody in my family owns a business, so I feel like, I don't know, I have this like entrepreneurial spirit where I was like, hey, like let's do this thing. um but yeah, I'd say that's part of the reason why like I got involved with Yaupon. And just Andrew came to me one day and he was like, hey, do you want to hear about this like plant? And like brought me some tea. And I was like, great, yeah. And when he asked me to come on board with Yaupon and like started mapping out like where he saw that this could go, I was almost like, this seems too good to be true. Like, this is a native plant. I mean, we went over all the benefits already, environmentally, um, health wise, the amazing communities that it's already grown in, which is primarily like Native American. And I was like, why isn't anybody doing this? Like, this just seems too obvious. So I think that, Andrew, who comes from a family of futurists, and people that are able to like, he could probably explain it better, but yeah, people that are able to like look in the future and predict like patterns and stuff like that, and mostly in it like a business sense, actually, not like a woohoo like hippie sense. But yeah, so I think that he was just ahead of the curve on seeing how everything could interconnect. And then when he exposed me to that, I was like, absolutely brilliant, I'm in.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you explain like the win-win scenario you're talking about? Just so people know what you're talking about, like you getting the Yaupon from people's land and for free, and then using that, how that works.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to go ahead with that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to this sort of this sort of innovative cycle that we're trying to really push. This positive feedback loop, in which, like Megan mentioned, in most business cases, you have winners and you have losers. And we kind of really wanted to look at this differently, and I think it really does come from our land stewards. And so compared to a traditional, tea company or like agricultural company, we don't have to buy a bunch of land or even own it in that sense. We set up management agreements with landowners. In a vast majority of senses, are very happy for us to manage their Yaupon. And so like Megan said, a lot of cases people have way too much. It's overgrown. It costs money for them landscaping wise to remove this Yaupon. There's also an impact too on the on dumps and on areas where this vegetation is going. And so for us, being able to source what is essentially a nuisance crop for free, so this is all done for free for our land stewards. And so they get a benefit by getting this Yaupon management service free of charge. We actually do provide some Yaupon in return to them. So they get free landscaping as well as some tea in return. Then for us, we are able to get a truly sustainably sourced product that, like Megan described with our sort of Goldilocks scenarios, we can always ensure that we're actually creating this positive benefit, both for the environment, because of all those ecosystem services, the increased biodiversity and soil health, but as well as with the community, because we're actually able to serve them this locally sourced, sustainable product that, can be consumed all right here in the U.S. And so in many different ways, we're able to sort of hit the win-win-win for both us, our consumers, as well as any of the supporters or land stewards in that cycle.
Yeah, and I think that something that's really great, because we have such low overhead from basically sourcing it for free, is that we're able to reinvest back into the community. And so then we're able to participate in, some urban farms that are popping up, lots of learning programs, working with schools, working with the local arboretum, and then also just funding our own research and innovation to developing some blockchain technology that allows us to measure the impact that the positive impact that we're leaving on land. And then we're building out our, what do you even want to call it, Andrew? Like our reward system.
Yeah, so I mentioned being able to monitor these sort of ecosystem services, these benefits that the Yaupon plant provides to the ecosystem. So we're actually working to be able to not only monitor, but to accurately record those benefits, and then sell them essentially to different companies and entities who are looking to reduce those impacts on their end. So carbon credits is a great example, being able to track the amount of carbon that we're able to sequester or prevent from being released into the atmosphere, and then being able to actually take that value, turn them into credits, and sell them to entities on the other end. So another really interesting, I think, innovative way to be able to reward our land stewards based off of the quality, essentially, of their Yaupon and how it's helping to regenerate the landscape.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So essentially you would be like selling the credit for doing work to improve the environment to companies that want to improve their carbon footprint or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Basically, this goes back to the Paris climate agreements, when people were like, all right, we're only gonna offset or put out X billion tons of carbon into the environment for each country. And so now the companies are like, okay, we can only put this much out. And so countries like the US and China, we put out way more than what we agreed to in the Paris climate agreements. And so some other countries don't put out as much. And so what they do is they can sell their carbon credits to American companies. That way it hits that neutral level. And so a lot of companies are doing that. If you look at, I think it was Delta that was like, hey, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030 or whatever it was. And so they release a ton of carbon into the atmosphere with every flight that they have. And so to become carbon neutral, I'm sure that they're innovating technology to release less carbon with flights. But we think that a big part of that is going to come from buying these carbon credits to offset what they're doing. So that way it hits back to neutral, where it's like, okay, we're, offsetting this much and we're going to buy this much just to bring it back to neutral. And so another example of kind of what we're doing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just was agreeing with you. Go ahead.
Yeah. Another way to look at it is we're giving value to the environment by just existing as an environment, right? So one of our good partners, they're working with the IMF to give value to whales. So currently, whales are only worth $80,000 once they're dead and you sell their blubber or whatever, right? Which, seems like a lot of money, but when you value them for what they can do for the environment, whether it's, they are huge carbon sinks, they can sequester tons of carbon. So if you look at how much carbon they're sequestering, they actually are worth $2 million alive every year. And so that's kind of what we're doing, is we're looking at a piece of land and we're not saying, okay, this piece of land is only an acre big, it's only worth, $10,000 for the rest of its existence. We're looking at it and we're saying, hey, look at all of these positive environmental things that are happening on this piece of land, can we give that value so this piece of land doesn't get developed? Or can we give that value so we can maintain it, sequestering carbon or increasing biodiversity in the area, which has all these other things. And so what I think that Andrew was so great about being ahead of is carbon credits are one thing, right? So we can look at carbon credits and there's, machines that can remove carbon from the air, but what is that doing for the entire environment around it? And so having this multifaceted way where we're looking at biodiversity, we're looking at carbon, and we're looking at nutrients in the soil and stuff like that, that gets a more well-rounded way to help the environment beyond just removing carbon.
Yeah.
I think too, for a lot of folks, like Megan was mentioning, people get really hung up on carbon. CO2 is obviously the sort of main driver of climate change in a lot of senses. So CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is sort of the metric to look at. Kind of what Megan, I think, was talking about is like, for example, these super high-tech carbon capture and storage devices, they don't provide a lot of co-benefits. So you can build a fancy machine that costs lots of money, it can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, but how are the plants and animals in that ecosystem benefiting? They're not really. And so for us, it's kind of a no-brainer. Plants, trees, are a great way to sequester carbon. Yaupon especially so, because it grows so well in those first few years. It actually beats out a lot of tree species in terms of total carbon sequester. And that's just looking at carbon. You can, like Megan said, I think more of the focus should be on things like biodiversity, things like soil health, water quality, which in a lot of cases are just sort of tack-ons to these carbon credits. And so sort of to backtrack a little bit, a lot of people have different opinions on carbon credits and the voluntary carbon market, as we call it. A lot of that stems from both the high cost to enact these projects, but as well as the lack of transparency. And so for a lot of these projects, they're done kind of behind closed doors by third-party companies who they themselves oftentimes can verify those credits and those impacts. And so you can see that there's potentially some points of concern there. And so mentioning the blockchain and sort of these community-based ways of displaying data and interacting allows it to be much more, you can feel much better about these projects, these carbon credit or ecosystem projects, when you can actually verify these changes. And so for us, being able to both reduce the cost of doing these projects, currently, you have to have many hundreds of acres, especially for state or like federal level grants, the sort of traditional route to get pieces of land conserved. You need lots of paperwork, and lots of land. And so for us, being able to shrink down the amount of land that we can start to conserve, as well as increase the transparency of that process. So people, we mentioned our dashboard, sort of ecosystem health dashboard, and that'll be really cool. It allows folks to actually look and see the different lands that we're helping to restore, as well as the different benefits those lands actually are providing. So for I think a lot of folks, in a lot of ways, this will be a really really innovative way to start accounting and reducing your footprint, both at a personal level, as well as with companies or government entities or even countries. So really exciting stuff in that regard.
Right. Yeah. And just that, I think a point that Andrew brought up that's really interesting is that when a business goes to develop a piece of land, they're able to say, hey, like, this is our projected income from this land and what it will do for the economy. And being able to put numbers to that talks, right? And that's how, a lot of pieces of land get developed, is because money talks, right? And so for us, being able to compete in that same sphere of saying, this is the value and this is how money will talk for conserving this land, I think makes it really competitive and viable in this capitalist like economy. So what he said earlier was that if you want to conserve a piece of land, you have to go through tons of paperwork, work with the government, the DEA, or EPA, And it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, right? And so again, when you have this shortcut that goes right to like saying like, okay, like this competes with whatever business that you want to put on this land, I think it makes the process much more efficient. And it also brings to people's eye the value of the environment.
I think one question that I have that seems to be like a bit of a disconnect in my brain is so you like can figure out the value of this land with all of your environmental improvements and tracking all of that kind of stuff. And then how does that translate into value that prevents a land from being developed? Does that make sense? Like, where would the value, the money go, and how would that prevent development?
Right. So for us, there's already a market carved out that for selling like carbon credits, and there's starting to be a market for eco credits, which is more of like what we kind of want to work with, because that again includes the biodiversity and the co-benefits. So say you take a piece of land that's 50 acres and you have the landowner sign an agreement that they're not going to build on it for 5 years. That 50 acres could be valued at $500,000 for 5 years. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to facilitate that transaction and facilitate giving that value. So what we would do is like we would take, some percentage that goes back to Yaupon, and then the rest of the money goes back to the actual like landowner. So what we can do is work with, say, the city of Wilmington that has all this land that's not touched, and people are going to compete for it because Wilmington is a cool place, businesses want to build there, whatever. But it's also, being where it is right on the ocean and inland and stuff, it's in a very vital place. And so for us, we could go to the city of Wilmington and say, hey, that 5 acres that's right on the ocean there, instead of developing that, why don't we turn that into, why don't we manage it and try to get eco credits from it? And then you guys will get $500,000 for that piece of land instead of giving it to a developer that, yeah, like it would also make money, but where we are on the coast, it's so volatile there and such a delicate ecosystem that are you considering, is it a floodplain? Like, how is that going to affect the local environment, like long term? What about North Carolina's coast is one of the most biodiverse, like how's biodiversity there? Like, so that's how it would kind of compete and make money versus like, developing a piece of land. Does that make sense?
That makes sense for me too. And a common theme that we've come across on this show now is that, there's kind of this relationship, this adversarial relationship between environmentally good ideas, but also cost. A lot of times it may cost more to do the thing that's going to benefit the environment. But it sounds like there's now this way where doing something good for the environment, for the ecosystem, can actually be very beneficial for companies, individuals, cities like Wilmington in this hypothetical situation, where if they do this, it will bring them in monetary benefits while also preserving the environment.
Exactly. That's the win-win-win.
The win-win-win.
Yeah, and you talking about like preserving land, especially on the coast instead of developing it. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and it makes me think about land that people owned, built houses on or businesses on, and then a hurricane goes by and wrecks the building and condemns the building. People can't live there anymore. People can't have their businesses there anymore. And the government ends up buying the building or buying the land and turning it into like a park that can't be used for anything else because it gets flooded so frequently. So I feel like never developing it in the first place and preserving the natural environment there may have prevented as much of the flooding, and also that wouldn't have been an issue in the first place. And then people would still make money off of the land because of the system that you're talking about doing. So that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And if you also think about, being in a very hurricane prone place and, beachfront property is very valuable, clearly.
Yeah.
If you think about these developers that are like, hey, like we want to put something here and we're going to put this money into the economy, but then when the hurricane comes, and all these construction materials and chemicals and stuff are being released into the water from these houses or businesses or what have you, that makes the water unswimmable like it was after Florence. That also hurts the economy. And so again, yeah, it goes back to, why don't we conserve the land? And why don't we also conserve the land and make money to reinvest into preserving it and the beauty and the economy?
There's so many ways that just make sense, especially with what you guys doing, I feel like.
I was just going to add on, I think that's too what makes it so exciting is that, you can, we can do this in such a way that by conserving lands, there can be additional profit and funding to further that, and that's this whole positive feedback loop is the more people we can get drinking Yaupon, the more lands we can get under management, and the more benefits we can then provide. And so I think the more and more that people, as well as businesses, governments, municipalities kind of get on board with the fact that it doesn't have to be profit over the environment. Like you said, they don't have to compete. There are ways now in which, you can help the environment and help the community or make a profit. And so, yeah, I think that's beyond just teaching folks about Yaupon and its benefits. I think that's really what we strive for, to kind of push beyond that and to show that, yeah, there's a lot of value in natural lands and ecosystems, especially in areas like here in Wilmington, where I think 97 point something % of all land is developed. And so that 3% of land, is even more important as it shrinks. And so being able to put a value, an economic value on that land and say, hey, it's this valuable just by leaving it alone, and so, yeah, it's really a bright future in that regard.
For sure, because I feel like historically speaking, conserving land and like leaving land alone did not equal money in most people's eyes. It was like basically not a waste, but like kind of, because they were like, oh, all this land, we could be doing something with it. And instead it's just sitting there doing nothing, which is like obviously very not true. It's not doing nothing. But so putting a literal economic value on something changes the game for people. That's really cool.
All right, guys, that is all we have now for part 1 of our 2-part podcast series with Yaupon. Be sure to go follow us on social media. Our new handle is at BBB Carolinas, and you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and of course, make sure to go listen to Good Guide on Spotify and follow us there too as well to stay updated on when part 2 is coming out. You can also follow us on Apple Podcasts and pretty much anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. We'll see you guys next time.